picture of me. There's no name. I don't know what happened.
Well, I never saw a picture of you, but I see your name.
Oh, you didn't?
Well, you could change the view. You could change the view of on the top right. You could change the.
Oh, show self view?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And on the bottom, you could display the video.
On the bottom? Where it says start video?
Yeah.
Oh, there I am. Okay.
Beautiful. Okay. Let me get to. Okay. Let's wait 2 more minutes and then we'll begin. Okay, let us begin. Everyone, welcome to the first of our ethics lessons, Cultivating Character, Life Wisdom from the Ethics of Our Fathers. So it's extremely helpful, instead of just speaking about ethics and Jewish ethics, to study from a text, an ancient text. You know, it gives a certain authenticity to any discussion we'll have, because the ethics of any individual shifts, and usually they pick it up based on the environment that they're in, the country and the politics that they play. But Jewish ethics are enduring and forever, and therefore, you know, it's always helpful to check ourselves to say, is the ethics that we carry, is that really the ethics of Judaism, or is that ethics that I picked up that is true for me now, but with time can change if it's tested? You know, Jews that are in the right-wing camp think that all right-wing beliefs are Jewish beliefs, and Jews that are in the left-wing camp think all left-wing beliefs are Jewish beliefs. And the truth is, Jewish ethics comes from a totally different model and wavelength, and of course it incorporates elements of the right-wing camp and the left-wing camp, but it's a totally unique flavor. So we're going to be basing it on Ethics of Our Fathers, and I'll go through the short history of what Ethics of Our Fathers is. And it is, and the reason we're doing it from this work is because it is a custom in many Jewish communities to read one of the 5 chapters of Ethics of Our Fathers between the festival of Passover and Shavuot. Shavuot is the day that we received the Torah. So when the Jewish nation first left Egypt, they're like, hold on, we're going to receive God's guide to humanity, but we kind of have to do some work to be prepared and to be ready. So it says that they started working on themselves for the 49 days in anticipation of the giving of the Torah. So we use this time between Passover and Shavuos to do internal homework and to improve our character. So therefore, many communities read. Now, there are actually 6 weeks between Passover and Shavuos. And therefore, there's a 6th chapter that's not in the original Pirkei Avos, that is a collection of other ethical teachings from the Mishnaic times. So what is Pirkei Avot? What is Ethics of Our Fathers? There has throughout the ages there has been a oral tradition of the Jewish laws, the Jewish stories, the Jewish teachings, and Kabbalah, and many other oral traditions that have been passed on from generation to generation in a very systemic process of elders who would constantly review the information to make sure it was accurate. But in the time of the Roman persecution of the Jewish people, at the years somewhere before 200 BCE until the period 200 CE, there was a great destruction for the Jewish people, and therefore it was very hard for us to maintain the oral tradition. And therefore, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi decided he's going to collect the teachings from the oral tradition and he's going to write down the legal teachings. And that's called Mishnah. And when those notes were unpacked in further generations, that was called the Talmud, together with the Mishnah. And mostly the Talmud deals with Jewish law. But just because something is kosher doesn't mean you should eat it. So you could have a whole tractate dedicated to kosher and say, is this item kosher? Is that item kosher? But it doesn't tell you if you should eat the kosher item. It just tells you you're allowed to eat it, not should you eat it. And so there was, out of the many tractates that deal with Jewish law, there was one tractate that told you how to live and what to aspire to. And that's this work called Pirkei Avot, is the teachings of ethics of how to live. Sometimes you don't have an obligation to do something, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't do it anyhow. So it's a book about going beyond the letter of the law. That maybe in the letter of the law, you're not obligated to do something or you're not required to do something, but the spirit of the law demands that you step up. So that's this work that we're studying today. Okay, so since the Jewish communities are in the 5th chapter, so we're going to start with the 16th Mishnah of the 5th chapter. And we'll take a volunteer to read for us text 1. Any takers?
I can't read Hebrew.
The English, there's English beneath
Okay,
the
I can
Hebrew.
read it English.
Okay.
Oh,
Should I make it a little bigger?
yeah. Okay. Any love that is dependent on something, when the thing ceases, the love also ceases. But a love that is not dependent on anything never ceases, which is a love that is dependent on something. The love of Amnon for Tamar, and one that is not dependent on anything, the love of David and Jonathan.
Okay, so just what we're going to do is we're going to explore the basic simple meaning of this text that's over 2,000 years old, and the teaching is even older than that. And we are going to and we're going to go through the basic meaning, and then we're going to go to the deeper meaning of this text. So the basic meaning is, if you have a love that's dependent on, hold on, give me a second. If you have a love that's dependent on something, when that something disappears, it's gone. What does that mean? So let's actually use the case studies. It brings here the love of Amnon for Tamar. So Amnon and Tamar is, King David was the second Jewish king of the Jewish people, and he had a few wives and many children from his different wives. So his son Amnon had a deep crush on a half sister of his, Tamar, and so he created a ruse where he was ill and asked Tamar to waitress to him and serve him. And when he was alone in the room with her, he raped her. And the Torah tells us that as much as he loved her before, he despised her even more afterwards. So this is a love that it wasn't a love for her, it was a love for something about her. And therefore, as soon as that thing stopped being, so let's say the thing about her that captivated Amnon's attention was the appeal of something that is off limits to him. As soon as he enjoyed it or had it, so then there was nothing appealing about Tamar anymore. And so he started to despise her. And that was one of the greatest tragedies in King David's household. And so that's something where you love somebody for money, you love someone for their beauty, for their looks, for their intelligence, for their connections, for their strength. No matter what it is, as soon as that thing disappears, the love will disappear. And so the Mishnah is telling us simply, don't base your relationships on something. Those relationships won't last. What is a love that is not dependent on anything? That is the love of David and Jonathan. So this story of David and Jonathan actually happened earlier chronologically in history than the story of Amnon and Tamar. This happened when King David was the second Jewish king. King Shaul HaMelech, was the first Jewish king. And Shaul despised David. He saw David as a threat to his rule and leadership. And eventually, what he predicted actually came true. King David actually became the next king. And so he was trying every excuse and ability to kill David. And the main reason why David survived is because King Saul's son, Jonathan, kept on protecting David. And you have to remember, for Jonathan, he only had to lose by this friendship. If his father finds out, his father will disown him. If King David becomes the king, Jonathan was the rightful heir to King Saul. So Jonathan's protection of David was out of pure love for David as a person. And therefore, there was an unshakable love, and therefore lasted forever. So we have to constantly be assessing our relationships with other people and think, how can I make this relationship more than just the things that excite me about this person? How can I make it about the person themselves? Because what ends up happening is, if you are only having a relationship with something about the person, but not the person themselves, you're really having a relationship with yourself, not the other person. So for example, if you have a guy and a gal, and they both love meatballs, they love Italian food, that is their love. Now, what happens when one of the party, and their whole relationship is based on their love of meatballs? What happens when one person stops liking meatballs, or he has other hobbies that are more important to him than his love for meatballs? So then that relationship disappears. Now, why did he spend so much time with this other who loves meatballs? Because he loves meatballs, and this other person is also interested in what he's interested in, so he's really loving himself. It's like the story of the fish, that the fish was running viciously away from the fisherman's net. He didn't want to be caught. But suddenly he heard the fisherman say to the other fisherman, I'm looking to find a fish for the king because the king loves fish. So this fish stopped swimming. He's like, finally I'm safe. I'm going to be caught by a fisherman who's sending me to the king, and the king loves fish. And then again, when the fisherman brings it back to shore and then brings it to the chef, and the chef says, this is a beautiful fish. The king loves fish. And suddenly the chef starts taking off the scales and throwing it in the frying pan and cutting it up. And the fish is screaming in her, but he's like, it must be this is for the greater good. In other words, if the king loves fish, he'll truly only has the best intentions for me. So maybe this torturous process that I'm going through in the kitchen is really some great kindness of the king for me. But he's starting to have doubts. And finally he's served on the king's plate. And the king yells and says, I love fish. What a beautiful fish. And so the fish is relaxed and calm. He says, finally, I'm reassured that the king loves fish. He only has my best intentions in mind. And suddenly the king sticks in his fork and starts to eat. And so the fish yells, you liar, you don't love fish, you only love yourself. So that's something we have to be very careful when we assume that we love another person. Are we really being honest? Are we really loving the other person? Or are we really just loving ourselves? So again, this is not something that's the letter of the law. The obligations are about action. And therefore you could have two people in a relationship that they're doing all the right things. They fulfill their obligations, but their motive is for the wrong reason, and therefore there's a very great risk that relationship won't last. There's a story of the two great brothers, Reb Eli Melech of Lezhensk and Reb Zusha of Anapola. They lived about 250 years ago, and they became famous in the later years of their life. But in the beginning, they used to travel as nobodies. Nobody knew who they were. Nobody knew of their greatness. One time they visited Vladimir, and it was late at night. They knock on the first door, a big mansion. There's lights on in the house, and there's a mezuzah on the door. So they say, we're Jewish travelers, and we're looking for a place to stay. A big man opens up the door, clearly the wealthy owner of the house. And he says, what am I, an innkeeper? There's a guest house next to the synagogue for the beggars. Try your luck over there. So they continue walking, and they see another light on, and they knock on the door. This is a more humble home. This is the home of the town scribe, the one who writes the Torah scrolls and the Mezuzah scrolls. And he's really God-fearing, simple man. And he invited them and welcomed them, and he gave them his last food in his house in order to provide for them. He shared his own bed with them. He warmed them up. Many years later, these two brothers become famous great rabbis. They're coming again to Ludmir, this time on a royal carriage with an entourage. They're famous rabbis. What happens is, every city had a lottery. Who gets to host the great rabbis that come to visit their city? And the one who won the lottery was this wealthy person who years ago unknowingly turned these two rabbis away. So what happens is he comes to welcome them, says, welcome, honored rabbis. I'm the one who won the lottery to have the merit to host you in my house. I have everything arranged, and we've been planning this for weeks, your stay. Anyways, the horse and wagon pull up to his house, and the wagon driver brings their suitcases into the room. And then the rabbis go on. They leave. So the host assumes they may be going on to pray. But after a few hours, he sees that the two brothers, their luggage is in his house, and the horse and wagon is in his stable. but the two brothers are not there. So they do an investigation and they find out he's at the scribe. So he goes to the scribe. How long are you going to stay by the scribe? They say, oh, we're sleeping here. We're staying here. Like, what do you mean? I won the lottery. He says, clearly, all you want is our wagon and our luggage. Because years ago, when we came just our pure selves, without the fancy entourage and luggage and chariot, you didn't want us. Now that we have all that, so here we sent it to your house, but we're going to stay by the scribe. So that's a beautiful story that illustrates this idea of a love that's based on things and superficial ideas versus a love that we have to cultivate for everybody. Really a love for everybody, to really care about others, not because of the things that they have or their abilities or their looks or their strength or their wisdom, but purely for just being them. This idea actually explains something very important about our relationship with God. We find something very fascinating, and it's something that all the commentary on the Torah deal with, which is the start of the Jewish people. The start of the Jewish people starts with Abraham, with a command from God saying, Lech lecha me'artzecha, go forth from your land and go to the land that I will show you. The Torah doesn't really give us a history of the context of who this Abraham was. It just told us who his father was, and very little details about his father and his brother and his wife. Very little context. It just jumps to Abraham at 75 years old. God tells him, go to the land I will show you. Compare that with Noah. Noah, it gives us subplot. It gives us context. It tells us Noah was the only righteous person in a corrupt generation, and therefore when God wanted to destroy the world, he thought of Noah to save. Compare that with Moses. Before God chose Moses as leader, it tells us the history of Moses, how Moses was saved, and he was brought up in the Pharaoh's home, and he looked out for the Jewish people, and he was a shepherd who looked out for the lone sheep. That sets up, it gives us an understanding of why Moses was chosen to be the leader of the Jewish people. But we don't get the history of why Abraham was chosen to be the father of the Jewish people. And so the Maharal, Rabbi Huda Lohi, who lived somewhere between 1520 and the early 1600s, he writes the following explanation. He says, if the Torah would have told us the context of Abraham, where Abraham's background was from, and what he accomplished, and he accomplished major things. We are told he sacrificed and self-sacrificed in order to spread the message that there's only one God, a creator God, and he was one he was a lone individual fighting for something that was right that nobody else stood for, and he was kind and generous. We don't hear anything about that because the Torah doesn't want you to think that the only reason that God chooses the Jewish people was because of these great qualities of Abraham. Because if the whole relationship of God and the Jewish people was dependent on some quality of Abraham, then if we, the children and descendants of Abraham, don't have that quality, we don't have the wisdom, we don't put in the sacrifices, we're not good all the time, we make mistakes. So God doesn't care about us anymore. His love for us stops. So that's why the Torah doesn't give you the background of Abraham, to set the record straight, that God's love for Abraham and his descendants is not a love that's dependent on anything. It's a love that independent of anything. And the same thing is we have to do in reverse. When we show our commitment to God and to what God wants from us, so either we could do it out of fringe benefits, serving God gives me meaning and purpose and makes me happy, and God will reward me and he won't punish me. Those are all ulterior motives. And if your love is based on the ulterior motive, or even a more pure motive, but it's based on logic and reason, then what happens when things stop making sense? What happens when you stop finding things to be so beautiful? What happens when you stop caring about the reward or the protection? So then your relationship with God ceases to exist, which in other words tells us that you never had a relationship with God. All you had was a relationship with yourself. You figured you'll have a better self-experience if you do what God wants. That's not a true relationship. And that's what Maimonides brings in text 2. If we could have a volunteer read for us text 2. Any volunteers? I'm going to pick a volunteer. Tzvi, Charlie, you want to read for us?
You want me to read in Hebrew or English?
To go to the English. Go to the English.
One who serves God out of love, fulfills the Torah and the mitzvot, and follows in the path of wisdom for no reason in the world, not out of fear that something bad will happen to them, nor in order to acquire benefit. Rather, one does the truth because it is true. And ultimately, good will also come because of it.
In other words, Maimonides is saying real service of God is doing it because it's right. It's the right thing to do. It's the truth thing to do, even not because of some benefit that will come to us. And a benefit will come to us, Maimonides assures us, but that's not the motive we should do it for. Now, after we take it to one extreme of the importance of doing things for pure motives, let's look at the following contradictory, supposedly, text that comes from the Talmud in Pesachim. If we could get another volunteer to do text 3 for us.
Pick one.
Bruce, you want to honor us with text 3? Or I see someone who's logged in under the name Ethics, but it doesn't say a name. Okay, I'll take the lead on this. Oh,
I can read it.
perfect.
I can read
Please.
this. Hi, my name is Steve. Hi,
Hi, Steve.
how are you?
Good.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rabbi.
Pleasure.
A person should always occupy themselves with the Torah and the mitzvot, even if it is not for its own sake, because from doing it not for its own sake, one comes to do it for its own sake.
Okay.
Help me with that.
So let me unpack it. The word lishma, for its own sake, means doing things idealistically. In other words, you're not doing something for a ulterior motive. So again, let me paraphrase. A person should always do Torah and mitzvot, even if it's not for pure motives, because from doing it for a ulterior motive, one will eventually come to do it for the proper motive. So what this teaching is telling us is, firstly, we have to be a little practical. If we expect every person to only enter a relationships from a pure motive and a pure love for other people, we'll have very few relationships in our life. And we'll do very little Torah mitzvahs, because many mitzvahs that we'll do, we'll only do it if we see the benefit in doing it. Well, otherwise, why would we do it? So the Talmud is telling us, don't be so hard on yourself. Don't try to be so idealistic that you'll only do things out of a pure motive. So for example, let's say someone donates charity because his name will go on the wall of the building. They'll be presented on the front of the building. He'll say his name on the building. So you might think that's such a despicable thing. This guy's giving charity. His whole motive is to get honor and prestige. What kind of thing is that? Shul should make a point to not allow donors to have their name on the wall, because they're sending a wrong message. They're sending a message that we do charity because it brings us fame and prestige, and not doing it for the right reason. And yet that is not what Jews do. Let's read this text that I'm bringing here, and I will read it. This is from a great Spanish sage, one of the greatest sages of his generation. And this was a question that was posed to him. There was a certain individual who owns a beautiful building next to the shul, next to the synagogue. And he built it all at his own expense. He paid for the whole building. And he wants to put his name on the entrance of the synagogue as a testimony to his donation. But some in the congregation object to this. So what is the law in this regard? This community sent their letter to this great rabbi saying, what is his view on the matter? And so his response was, in our community, it is our custom that we do in the name of the donors, as is done in all holy communities of Israel. And the reason he goes on to explain is because if you don't do that, so first of all, you'll have less buildings. Facts are facts. People will give more when they get some credit for what they do. Plus, even if the donor says he doesn't want his name on the building, he shouldn't be so selfish, because by putting his name on the building, he's encouraging his wealthy friends to copy and to say, hey, he's giving charity, we'll also give charity. So sometimes we think we're being more humble and more idealistic by being an anonymous giver. The Rashba says, maybe you're doing more good by advertising and sharing on Facebook all the charity that you give, because it'll encourage your social network to give more as well. So that's one level of that. On the one hand, we should always strive for perfection and idealistic, pure, free of ulterior motive relationships and actions. But we shouldn't wait till we're holding there to start building the relationships and to start doing the Torah and mitzvahs. You know, there was a rabbi who was giving classes on Hasidic wisdom, and he would do it. It was in Russia in the late 1800s, and they would meet Saturday nights, and they would serve a drink that was like hot, boiling water with vodka and honey. And there was a large attendance for this class. And when he went to visit his Rebbe one year, his Rebbe, his Hasidic master, told him, what, you're serving this drink by a Hasidic class? What does Hasidic wisdom have to do with this drink? This drink is, you know, it's like serving candy. It's degrading for the Hasidic wisdom. So he stopped serving it. And when he returned to his Rebbe a year later, he reported a much lower attendance. So his Rebbe said, if that's the case, then of course you have to bring back the drink. At least people should study the Torah. So, you know, it's similar with the known saying about diets. The best diet is the diet that works. You know, so you could have doctors arguing which diet is the best diet. But if it's just because it's the best in the lab, doesn't mean it's the best diet if nobody could keep it or nobody could do it. So that's one level. That's a practical level. But we're going to take this one level deeper. And with that, we'll conclude this lesson. And that is that we have to recognize that we have a soul inside of us that wants to do everything for pure reasons, but it doesn't get a voice. It very rarely gets a voice. Usually our voice that we think in and we do things in is our animalistic soul, which is our natural soul. The soul that has an instinct for survival, which includes an instinct for pleasure and honor and survival. And that's the main way, the main thing that motivates us to do things. And meanwhile, our godly soul is trapped inside, has no voice. And so the truth is, when we do something for an ulterior motive, for our godly soul, we're doing it for a pure motive. It just takes on an outer trapping of the animal soul. And so the truth is, every time we do a mitzvah, even when we think we're doing it for an ulterior motive, we have to recognize that there's a part of us that is innocent, and it is really doing it because it is the right thing to do and is the pure thing to do. So when the Mishnah is telling us that there's a love that's dependent on other things, and there's a love that's independent, and that's a love that will last, it's telling us, try to assess from time to time all the relationships that you have and upgrade them. Just because a love started for an ulterior motive or some ulterior, superficial aspect about the other person, or when you are doing a mitzvah, you are doing it for a immature place, upgrade it. Don't abandon it. Don't think that these loves cannot be upgraded. They can be upgraded and deepened, that we could exchange and substitute the love that's based on something about the other person to being a love of the person themselves. A love for Hashem to be pure and humble. So that's ultimately what this mission is teaching us. Is something that we constantly have to reassess on everything we do. Everything, in other words, we have to remember both these concepts. On the one hand, we have to do what's good, even if it's paved with poor intentions, as long as we do the right thing. And on the other hand, we have to constantly be upgrading everything that we're doing to make sure we're doing it as best as we can. Okay, and that's it for today. Next class on ethics will be same place, same time next week, Tuesday at 7:30. Our upcoming classes are Friday at 6:30 for a half hour Torah studies class, and then Sunday, positivity bias, a 20-minute class at 2 o'clock or 2:30. I'll check the schedule. Okay. Thank you, everyone, for joining, and have a wonderful day.
יישר כוח, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Happy Lag Bomer.
Happy
Okay.
life.